The Windham World Affairs Council. We're really glad to be here, especially at the Brattleboro Musuem Art Center. In a town the size of Brattleboro, we feel it's really important to work with our fellow institutions, and we're really glad to start this cooperation with the museum. And also on this topic, because it's one that transverses both international affairs and the value of art in our culture. So we really appreciated that. Before we introduce our speaker, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the Windham World Affairs Council to the people who aren't familiar. We were founded in 1961 as a forum for discussing world affairs here in Brattleboro. We're the smallest of the 90 chapters of the World Affairs Councils of America. It's an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging the public and leading global voices to better understand the world, America's international role, and the policy choices that impact our daily lives and future. We're committed to making our speakers and events free to the public and accessible to all, and we rely entirely on the support of the public at large to do that. Our support is derived primarily from membership dues and donations we received at this event, so thank you for that. And if this is your first event, or if you've been attending many of our events, please consider joining as a member and get to know our interesting and active group of international thinkers. Student memberships are free, individual memberships are $35, and family memberships are $50. And you can join online via our website, and there's information outside at our table. And come talk with one of our board members. The other two that are here tonight are here.
Tamara.
And I'm Scott. Great.
Welcome, thanks for coming.
And our membership and donations also support two other programs. Our Peace Jam program, which we launched here at the Brattleboro Union High School with Jody Williams, a Nobel Prize laureate and local from here. And as well, you get the benefit of our Member and Friends Salon every month, which we host at 118 Elliott for informal discussions on international topics. Also, I want to mention briefly two events we have coming up. On March 14th, there will be a virtual literary cocktail hour with the Brattleboro Literary Festival on the book The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism. It's currently a bestseller in the UK, and the author, George Monbiot, will be on the Zoom to talk about it. And then 2 days later, on March 16th, on Sunday, we're having a screening of a documentary about the book here at the Latches Theater, and the filmmaker will be here to talk about it, Kate Hutchinson. Both of those are at 5 p.m. And then tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Pierre Losson. He's my friend and PhD classmate. In fact, he was the only one in our political science program studying cultural policy, and also this topic, which was sort of emerging in the headlines at the time we were studying. And this topic touches on international relations, decolonization, and then our understandings of national identity and artistic value. So we felt it was a really interesting one to hold here. His book, The Return of Cultural Heritage to Latin America, Nationalism, Policy, Politics in Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, was published by Routledge in 2022, and last year in Spanish by Fondo de Cultura Económica. He's also published scholarly articles in the International Journal of Cultural Policy, International Journal of Heritage Studies, and Studies of Conflict and Terrorism, as well as mainstream publications like Le Monde. Pierre has held several positions in French cultural centers in Mexico and Peru, where he lived for 10 years. And then he holds degrees, because this topic transverses many fields. He holds degrees in international relations, in arts administration and Latin American studies, in addition to our PhD in political science from the Graduate Center CUNY. And he currently works at the City College of New York and has taught at various CUNY campuses and Yeshiva University. So welcome, Pierre. Thank you.
Well,
first of all, thank you so much, Meryl, and thank you to the Windham World Affairs Council for this invitation. This is a topic that I love to talk about, so I could speak for hours. So you'll have to stop me if at some point you think that I'm just taking too long. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. So I want to try to maybe offer like a broad presentation of the topic of restitution of cultural heritage in general. So if you're very familiar with this topic, please forgive me for maybe some approximation as I try to paint this very broad and large landscape for us tonight. I wanted to start with a really broad question, which is, what are we talking about when we talk about restitution of cultural heritage? To answer this question, it's very important to understand cultural heritage as a social construct. So what do I mean by that? Is that we do not naturally care for old things. The fact that something is old does not necessarily mean that we consider it a part of our heritage. We care about these objects to which we assign a specific meaning. And we are educated into these meanings, whether within our own family, our larger community, or maybe our nation as like maybe possibly the largest community with which we could feel some sense of identification. So this is important for me to keep in mind, because the topic of restitution does not concern all antiquities or all cultural objects or all artworks in all museums of the world, but only these objects to which we ascribe this specific meaning. With that said, I want to introduce one date as like a key moment in time to keep in mind for what we're going to discuss tonight. That date is 1970. Why? Because that year, the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property, sorry, that was long, was adopted under the auspices of UNESCO. And it remains to this day largely considered a watershed moment on this topic of restitutions. That is not to say that there is one situation that applies to all the objects displaced before and to all the objects after, if for no other reason, because not all states became subscribed to sign that convention and then transferred it into their national legislation, but also because there are other international and national laws that rule this topic. Yet, this convention has really contributed to redefining the ethics and practice of cultural heritage restitution. So it is really generally nowadays considered untenable for a museum to hold on to an artifact whose provenance, and that's a word I will be using several times tonight, cannot be traced back to before 1970. So if a museum cannot justify that an object in its collections had been legally acquired by that time, it is very difficult to make an argument to keep it in its collections today. So with that in mind, let's see a little bit what kind of reality and cases we can encounter based on this. So objects that were removed from their original context after 1970 and the adoption of the UNESCO Convention, either in application of this convention or other bilateral treaties. For example, the US has treaties on this topic with many Latin American countries, with Cambodia, other Southeast Asian countries. So these objects can be sent back to their community or country of origin when it can be proved that they were still in their original location in the 1970s. So I'm sorry, it might be a little small for those who are seated at the back. I put you some recent examples that made some headlines in the news. So you see here Khmer statues that were returned by the Metropolitan Museum of New York after photographs from 1970 came to light, showing that the statues were still at that date in the temple of Kokher near Angkor Wat. Another example, you have here at the bottom left a statue of Vishnu that was returned to Nepal after, again, photographs from the 1980s showed that this statue was still in the temple that it had been made for in the 1980s. And then a very recent example, because that's from last week, and that actually shows how 1970 is maybe more of a symbolic than a legal date in all cases. We have here a statue of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius that was in the collections of the Cleveland Museum of Art. That statue was surrendered to the Manhattan DA's office in order to return it to Turkey after it was proved that the statue had been taken from the archaeological site of Buban in contemporary Turkey, probably sometime in the 1960s. But again, that's where, let's say, that this change in ethics that was introduced by the UNESCO Convention made it really unethical at that point for the museum to keep holding on to this object. So again, those are just like 3 high-profile examples, but there are virtually thousands of objects that are seized every year at customs, or that are seized in private homes, or even in museums, as a consequence of the contemporary trafficking in antiquities, which is booming in war-torn countries, but really not only. Many countries have such a rich cultural heritage that it's virtually impossible to protect everything, whether it's the product of illegal archaeological excavations, for example, or actually the product of theft from temples, from churches, or even from local museums that do not necessarily have the highest standards of security. Again, I gave you the date of 1970 as a reference more than necessarily an enforceable date in legal procedures. So all these objects and artworks are being seized in application of international conventions and treaties, but really more simply because, or maybe as an alternative explanation, because the ethical context for the passing and application of these legal norms has changed greatly over the past 50 years. So now I want to turn to other categories of cultural objects, those that were removed in the colonial or imperial context, or in any case, before there were any kind of international conventions on the topic. So for these cases, really no law applies. So I often prefer to speak about return more than restitution, because there is really little legal case for restitutions in the legal sense of the term. And any agreement that can be found between a holding museum and a country or a community of origin can only really be the result of political negotiations. So I'm from political science, so that's when I get all interested. So I want to give you a few of those examples. I'm pretty sure you've heard about some, if not all, these examples. So the first one is that of the Parthenon marbles. It may be the most emblematic pending case of restitution in the world at this point. Greece has been asking for the return of the marbles for at least 45 to 50 years at this point. Those marbles were taken directly from the Parthenon temple in the early 1800s by Lord Elgin, who was at the time the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman Empire. And it's really a textbook case of return negotiation, again, because it combines several elements that make it impossible to find a solution through legal channels. So there is a debate, for example, over whether Elgin really was given the permission to take down the marbles and take them with him to England. Greece, for that matter, was not even an independent state at the time. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, like early 1800s, there were no laws on the removal or export of antiquities at the time. So then the questions become, does modern Greece, which considers itself the heir of the classical Athenian era that produced the temple, a legitimate heir and has a legitimate claim to those marbles? Can the British Museum hold on to the marble by just shielding itself, as it does, behind its own bylaws? Because what the British Museum basically says is that it does not have the power on its own to decide to deaccession these marbles from its collections, but it has to be an act of parliament that would allow for the transfer of the marbles back to Greece. So as the international mood seems to have switched towards greater appreciation for post and decolonial claims, how much longer can the museum hold on to the marbles without really losing all its moral standing is really an open question. A second case that has been making headline over the past 5 years is that of the Benin bronzes. So the Benin bronzes are an ensemble of artifacts, to be sure, not at all in bronze, but some of them in ivory, wood, other materials, that were looted from the royal palace of Benin City, which is a city in contemporary Nigeria, so not to be mixed with the country Benin. Those objects were looted during a so-called punitive expedition by the British Imperial Army in 1893. That was really a war of colonial conquest. The soldiers that participated in the expedition brought the objects back with them to England, and from there the objects were inherited to their descendants, they were sold, and well, little by little found their way into the collections of museums, not only in the UK, but also in Germany, in the Netherlands, and to be sure here in the US. So the federal state of Nigeria, which again did not exist at the time, has shown an interest in recovering these artifacts since basically independence in the 1960s. And back in 2007, a consortium formed with the federal authorities in charge of heritage in Nigeria and many museums that hold these bronzes in their collection, including the British Museum and many museums in Germany and in other countries. Basically, this consortium aims at discussing the fate of the museum. Not only their possible return, to be sure, but also their conservation, their research projects, digitalization, which has become a very important topic to be able to continue research even without having an object physically in a museum's collection. So the Benin Dialogue Group, as this group came to be known, has led to several announcements since 2020 that the bronzes would be returned to Nigeria. So those announcements came from university museums in the UK, the public museums of Germany and the Netherlands, some university museums in the US as well. But again, interestingly enough, not the British Museum, which has basically presented the same kind of argument as it has in the case of the Parthenon marbles. So now I want to take you to Latin America because that's my field, and so like those are stories that I've had the opportunity to look at in depth, and I think that those are really interesting case studies. The first one I want to talk to you about is the Penacho de Moctezuma, which you could translate by Montezuma's headdress. Moctezuma was the last Aztec emperor at the moment of the Spanish conquest in 1519. So there is actually quite little that we know about the object itself. For example, there is little evidence that it ever belonged to Moctezuma himself, may have been used by a priest. We're not even sure that it was actually a headdress. And there are competing theories about how this object left New Spain, so contemporary Mexico, in the 16th century. It may have been looted from Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs at the moment of the conquest. It may have formed part of an ensemble of gifts that Moctezuma gave to Cortes when he arrived. What we do know, because for that we have archives, is that this object was already in Europe in a castle of the Habsburg family by 1596. So that's a really long time ago, and that's actually quite a short time after the Spanish conquest. Since at least the 1980s, Mexico has been trying to obtain its return to Mexico, arguing that it is a very important symbol of Mexican national identity. But Austria argues against this return, arguing that this artifact has actually been in Austria for so long that it has come to form part of Austrian cultural heritage. And that anyway, it has no legal obligation to return it, and adding on to this that the object is so fragile that if it were to be transported across the sea, it would probably disintegrate. So that's basically where we stand. A little further south, that may be a case you may have heard about because it happened quite close from here. In 2010, Peru obtained the return of the Machu Picchu collection that was in the collections of the museum, the Peabody Museum at Yale. And the collection was sent back in 3 batches to Peru in 2011, 2012. So that collection came to Yale because an archaeologist named Hiram Bingham led the first scientific excavation at Machu Picchu in 1911, 1912. He did not, contrary to what Yale argued for so long, discover Machu Picchu. That's an extremely colonialist view to take. I mean, the people who lived there, not there as in Machu Picchu, but like in the region, they always knew Machu Picchu was there, and they are the people who took Hiram Bingham there. So there was no discovery in that sense. But there is no contesting that he is the one who made the first scientific excavation, which yielded really interesting results. Like still today, there are scientists at Yale and other places who work on the product of those excavations. So Hiram Bingham, at the end of his excavation campaign, took with him more than 5,000 objects that he found during his excavation. He did take it with the permission of the Peruvian government at the time, only that the agreement specified that the objects should be returned 18 months later. I won't go over all the details of all this, but the collection was not returned and kind of like fell into oblivion until the 1980s, 1990s. And starting in the early 2000s, the Peruvian government started to mount like a campaign to obtain the return of the collection to Peru. And it really transformed into a very bitter battle. There were some quite bad words exchanged along the way. And the university initially argued that the statute of limitations had expired, so it had no obligation to return the collection. And but ultimately Yale barred, like under pressure from all the voices internationally, and even the Alumni Association was against its own university on that topic. And so ultimately Yale agreed to return the collection, but in 2010. So it took like more than 10 years of negotiation to get to that result. The last example I want to give you about like this colonial / imperial context for the displacement of some objects is that of San Agustin. And I want to talk to you about this one because I think that this for me is one of those cases that as a researcher in political science, I tried to look at all these cases as coldly as I could. I did not think that being a researcher, it was my place to take sides. And this is one of those examples where it just became impossible not to. And so like today I'm still working with the people in San Agustin to try and find strategies to make sure that these statues one day will return to San Agustin. So this is an interesting case because it goes really parallel to the one of Machu Picchu. So I told you that Hiram Bingham was in 1911, 1912 in Peru. So just further north in the Andes, a German archaeologist, Konrad Theodor Preuss, was also traveling and making discoveries. He visited San Agustin, took with him more than 30 statues, and sent them back to Germany, but after World War I, because like for 4 years it was a little complicated to have that kind of material shipped overseas. It is, in this case, however, there is no evidence that he ever did this with the authorization from the Colombian government. Another thing that for me is really interesting in this is that for decades, the Colombian government actually showed no interest in getting these statues back. Showed no interest as in a lot of people knew that those statues were there and nobody asked for them, which of course is an argument that the German museum has used against the current claim. And it's finally local activism that launched the claim. First, local residents of the contemporary town of San Agustin. San Agustin is an archaeological site, but there is also a colonial town. So it's inhabitants of that town who got interested in the fate of those statues. And then they started receiving support from local indigenous groups. And interestingly enough, the judicial branch of the Colombian state that actually ruled in their favor and told the Colombian executive that the Colombian executive had to make sure that its own laws were being respected. And so for now, a few years, there have actually been negotiations between the Colombian government and the Humboldt Forum, which is this big new museum that was formed in Berlin a few years ago by the reunion of other smaller museums. But yeah, those are ongoing negotiations. So what do all these cases have in common? As you see, somehow little, because they are all the fruit of peculiar historical conditions, but all are really like thorniest cases, because there is no legal obligation that would push all the stakeholders into the realm of ethics or morals. All these claims are historically situated, and what seemed right or could have been accepted a century ago does no longer seem right to us today. So now that I've painted, like, again, very large brush, this distinction between recent and maybe more ancient cases of displaced cultural heritage, I also want to add two categories of restitution claims that I think have their own ethical, moral, and of course legal implications, and that I think are really important for the current and future life of museums, not only here in the US, but worldwide. The first one is that of the artworks and objects that were seized from Jewish families during the Nazi era in Germany, and in the Western countries conquered by the Nazi regime in the early stages of the war. I think during World War II, we saw what may have been an unprecedented movement in its nature and scope of confiscation of artworks and other cultural heritage, because we're also talking about music instruments, books, furniture. So we often hear about artworks such as the ones that I'm showing here, but it's really a whole ensemble of objects. And that happened when the Nazi regime organized on a massive scale the spoliation of Jewish families. And the work of restitution of these spoliated artworks has been made very difficult by the destructions of the war. So many archives were burned or destroyed, and also by the fact that entire families were wiped out. So in many cases, there was no one to even claim these objects. So actually several dozens of thousands of objects were returned in the first 5 to 10 years after the war. However, many never found their way back to their original owners or to their descendants. So, for example, in France, there are about 2,200 paintings specifically that were deposited in the national museums of France. They do not belong to France. They are there. They are being held in like the professional environment that they need, but they are supposed to be available for restitution in case someone would come forward with a valid claim and a valid legal title to those objects. And also many of the artworks that were never claimed also found their way to private collections through successive sales, and then some of them back into museums, again in Europe, but also a lot in the US. And those are the cases that, of course, make headlines in the news. So I just show you here two. On the left, you have a very famous painting by Klimt. There is a movie about that story, and that was returned to the Hair in 2006. But again, this is a very contemporary topic. This is a case from last fall of a series of drawings by Egon Schiele that were seized by the Manhattan District Attorney, again in this case, after evidence was presented that they had been stolen from its original owner in 1941. The original owner had died in Dachau, and his heir were able to demonstrate and to show title to these works. So the resolution of these disputes these days are governed by the Washington Principles, that are the result of a conference that took place in 1998 and in which more than 40 countries, I think, participated. So again, we're not talking only about works directly stolen by the Nazis from the dwellings of Jewish families in Europe, but we must also consider all the artworks that were sold under duress, starting in 1933, which is usually the date that is now accepted. So many of the current cases we see in tribunals ask the judge to determine to what extent the original owners had to sell their artworks under duress. So either because they were forced to, because they could not legally hold their business anymore as Jewish people, because they had to flee Europe precipitously, and that was their only way to find the financial resources. So again, this is what the Washington Principles try to define, and that judges today abide to in many of those legal cases. The second category that I wanted also to highlight is that of human remains. So anthropology and archaeology are scientific disciplines that consolidated in the late 19th, early 20th century. And museums, particularly, but not only natural history museums, constituted vast collections of human remains. So that could be bones, hair, but also related funerary bundles, so objects in which bodies were interred, for example. So those collections were constituted for scientific purposes, but also, as has been largely evidenced, to support racist ideologies of white supremacy, demonstrated by allegedly superior physical traits, for example, that could be studied from skulls. So I think interesting here is the concern over these human remains have come from different groups and different stakeholders with different agendas and different concerns. So we have, of course, native and indigenous communities here in the US, or in the US because we're here, but it's true in many of the settler countries like Canada, Australia. So these communities with the legitimate concern of wanting to recover the remains of their ancestors. But also in the US, these groups found actually the support of other religious and specifically Christian groups that agreed that bodies should not be retained against the will of their descendants. And that's really how we explain that the US had passed a law on this topic quite early. We're talking about 1990, that's already 35 years ago. So the NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, was adopted during the administration of George Bush Sr. And this law mandates that US museums that receive public funds must classify and make public their human remains collection, and they must engage in conversations with the descendants when those can actually be identified over the fate of these remains. That does not necessarily mean that they must be returned. Not all native communities necessarily want those bones. So there can be a wide range of solutions that can be found. For example, many museums conserve the collections but agree not to display them, to only give access to members of that specific native community to see or examine them. So there's like a range of solutions. And I think more general, in the 35 years since NAGPRA, we've seen how like anti and decolonial groups in the US, but really everywhere, have also really started to consider that human remains are not just like any other artifacts or objects that can be found in museums, and that bodies cannot be objectified in the name of science, especially considering the racist use of these collections in earlier decades. And there is, I think today, a growing consensus in the museum world that bodies should not be displayed and should not serve as objects of scientific investigation without consent of either the person themselves or their descendants. Okay, so that was like a very quick overview, I think, of where we are now on the question of restitution. I think if you read cultural and art section of major newspapers, you've probably heard about some of those cases. So what I want to discuss with you now is really where does that leave us? What does it say about our society, about our moral and ethical concerns, and also what can we expect for the future of museums? I want to start with yet another question. Why do we see all these claims today? That for me as a researcher, when I started my own research, that was like the big question of like, why are we talking about this now? Like those objects have been gone for so long. So why was it not a big question a century ago or even before that? I've tried to answer this in my book like through many different angles. One that I want to underline is nationalism as a driver of return and restitution claims. So the opponents to restitution claims, who are often the director of those like big museums, British Museum, Metropolitan Museum, particularly for those cases like of objects displaced in the colonial, imperial, post-colonial context, usually often disparage the claims for the return on the basis that these claims would just be like misplaced nationalism that would go against the interest of science in the conservation of objects in the name of humanity as a whole. I think that through my research, I've come to agree, at least in part, with that argument, in the sense that I do believe that yes, nationalism is an important factor. Just not nationalism in the far right understanding of the word, but rather as a narrative to forge a common past for a community. I think people need to feel that they belong, and nationalism provides a backstory for a group, whether this group is ethnically or linguistically homogeneous or not. So nationalism is also a very important factor because nation states remain to this date the principal actors in international relations. And these are international claims with negotiations taking place from one government, with one government and another. I think this is also why we see that government officials and experts who work for the government are often the main actors involved in these claims. But I do think, against those who oppose the restitution claims out of principle, that this sense of nationalism does not really exclude a real sense of concern for science, or even for the idea of a cultural heritage that would belong to humanity as a whole. I've spoken to dozens of people who are perfectly able to articulate both discourses at the time and do not see that one opposes the other. So I think it's entirely possible to want to obtain physical possession of an object, to conserve it, and to want it to safeguard this object for the benefit of humanity as a whole. Since the late 20th century in particular, and for example, the story I was telling you about Colombia, I think is a good example of this. We've seen the development of other actors at like the sub-national level that are interested in this topic. So they can be local communities, indigenous or native, but not necessarily. And I think that this has been, for me, one of like the main surprises of my research. In Latin America, almost all the cases that I studied did not originate in some government office. They originated because someone or a group of someones took an interest in a specific object, started their own campaign, lobbied their own government, and then at some point the government took over and started those international negotiations. But I thought that this was really interesting because it also shows that as individuals we can have this specific attachment to objects. It's not just like this big narrative of like, I don't know, a government telling us this is our national heritage. I think this is something that we can feel also deeply at a personal level. And I guess that also brings me back to my original and my introductory comment, that what drives the current wave of restitution is also in part the fact that we attach specific meanings to specific objects from our past. And I will insist again on this, specific objects, not all objects. Nobody wants everything back to its original place, even if it were possible to actually determine what this original place is. So we construct heritage because we curate our past. We choose to remember certain moments, certain events, certain people, and not others. So there's a lot that we do not consider worth or important to preserve, but that can also change. What we consider important today may not seem that important a few years from now, and vice versa. And that's actually the basis of an argument that I made in an article a few years ago. I do not believe, as again the directors of those big museums have tried to make us believe, that the existence of museums is endangered by the current wave of restitutions. I think the fear of the people who make these arguments is that agreeing to a few returns or restitutions would like create a general precedent that would lead to emptying the collection of museums. But again, I think, as I tried to show you today, most of these cases are really historically situated. They have specific sets of conditions and actors. So agreeing to one return does not necessarily mean that the same logic and the same argument can be applied to others. And again, when I spoke again to dozens of people, in my case in Latin America, nobody ever told me, I want absolutely everything that is from Mexico in world museums worldwide back to Mexico. Because these people are professionals, just like there are professionals here, who understand that they have limited capacity to care for all these objects. They have themselves other archaeological sites to excavate. They have collections in their own museums that they have not used for research yet. So this is just not a thing. Now, what can be the consequences if I tell you that they're not going to be emptied? What are going to be the consequences of these restitutions for museums today? And so I want to finish this presentation with a few comments. First, I think we are really in a moment when it is widely considered and accepted that it is necessary to reconsider the role of museums in the 21st century. Museums conserve and display their collections for the greater good. But again, what has been the ethical price to enable these institutions of knowledge, hence of power, to keep objects and human remains? To what extent is the fact of possessing, legally or not, objects or human remains really indispensable to this mission? I think that today, with the development of international travel, but also the advance of technology, such as digitalization, for example, as I was mentioning in the case of the Benin bronzes, I think it's more difficult to justify holding on to an object in the name of science, because research can continue even without holding on to an object in a collection, an object that could not go out of a specific place. My second comment is that restitutions must be considered in the within the context of the contemporary debate of the decolonization of museums. But restitution is not a synonym of decolonizing museums. That not because you're going to return a few objects means that as a museum you are decolonizing your practices. I think that for that, museums also have to interrogate what it is that they display, how they display it, who makes the decision of keeping an object and of showing this object. They have to engage diverse audiences and stakeholders, not only as visitors, but also actively in how we are going to show what it is that we are going to show. So I think the recognition that collections were often gathered in circumstances that today seem wrong lead to considering reparations, which can also be a purpose that restitutions can serve, to try and repair historical injustices. I think one category of museums that is really brought into question in this whole thinking of decolonization of museum is the specific model of the Universal Museum. So by that, I mean, again, the Met, the Louvre, the British Museum, in general, all these museums that pretend to conserve the output of human activity over the course of our history as a species. Universal in that sense, or at least from a decolonial perspective, is really a Western-based concept and concern. And I think that universal museums particularly cannot afford not to go through like a cathartic process of re-examining their past, re-examining how they form their collections, and really reformulating their collection. their mission. How can they do that? Again, from the specific angle of restitution, is by continuing and expanding the work of provenance research. So provenance research is a really, it's a new category of workers in museums. There is never enough resources dedicated to it, but I think some museums are just more genuinely involved in that process than others. Provenance researchers are often historians or museum experts who are trained and specialized in reconstituting the history of an object. So before it arrived in the museums, what was its trajectory between the moment it was created, left its community or its place of origin, and arrived in the museum. And that can sometimes be very complex because there may have been tens of owners in between. Documents disappear, so it's a very complicated task. And then my final thought is that I think that there is this idea again that maybe restitutions are going to be a revolution for museums. And I think that actually they are not, in the sense that they do not change the paradigm in which we consider and we think about cultural heritage. That is, we keep thinking that these objects should be conserved as museum objects. When we are talking about restitutions or returns, we really talk about taking an object from a museum and bringing it to another museum. So we change countries, we may change hemisphere, we may go from the global north to some developing country, but the very idea behind it has not changed. We are still conserving an object. And I think that most return processes do not challenge this idea of conservation. So now, what I think is something that could be much more revolutionary would be to think about the re-socialization of an object. What if instead of bringing it to a new museum, we would find a new social function for this object? In the case of human remains, if they are being reburied, as in in their community of origin, for example, we are talking about objects, museum objects that are going to disappear, that are going to disintegrate. The same thing for an object that is, again, re-socialized. So when I mean re-socialized, I think about, I don't know, the object from a royal palace that is sent back and then is used again in religious or I don't know, patriotic festivals, or these objects are going to decay. So that for me is something that is much more revolutionary, because now we are talking about the possibility that what is at the core of the museum work, that is the conservation, may now not happen, because the function of the object that is being returned is going to change once it is returned to its original range. That's what I wanted to say for tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, that gives us a lot of rich questions to think about, and we'd like to open it up for Q&A. I know there's some people with some really specific experiences and knowledge to share, so. And
I spoke way longer than I had said.
yeah, that's okay, but we could take 10 or 15 minutes, I think. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Do you know anything about what happened after the United States invaded Iraq and the destruction of so many artifacts? And is that still going on?
So yes, it's definitely still going on, in the sense that there were so many, like we're talking about dozens of thousands of objects that disappeared from, for example, the National Museum in Baghdad. So specifically what happened there is that a member of the US like a U.S. Army deployed in Baghdad, is now works in the Manhattan DA's office, and he has led a task force in charge of trying to recuperate as many as possible of the objects. So he's done like an incredible work of finding those objects, either in Iraq before they were exported, or then like finding them in the US, or probably even in other countries, collaborating with authorities in other countries. So yeah, it's
so
been
they
a
did
huge
find,
task.
some of them were brought back.
Yes, absolutely, a lot.
A lot of them, just
Yep.
by,
I don't have like numbers to
Right.
give you on the top of my head, but yes, many.
but I mean, it was kind of a free reign at some point.
Yeah. Well, the museum was looted basically. So yeah, we're talking about again dozens of thousands of objects that were looted from the museum. Yeah. Mhm. But again, this is typically a case where there is no way that a museum today could acquire this kind of object and just put it on display. Like, because this happens in 2000, 2003, you cannot be a serious museum and today keep this kind of objects in your collections. You're just, because it's not legal to start with, but again, because the way this object would have come to your collections makes it ethically untenable. So those are objects that went to feed rather like the private trafficking of antiquities. It's beyond my understanding why anyone would want in their home an object that they can never sell at an auction house because they have no legal title to it, that they cannot really exhibit because if it is known that they have it, then the Manhattan DA, for example, could show up and just confiscate the object. But there are a lot of people who apparently buy this kind of objects. Yes?
Would you relate this same concept towards like the crown jewels that were sold from India during the East Indian Trading Company, and the British regime took the jewels, and they're now, I believe, I think they were part of Queen Elizabeth's crown. Would you still relate that same concept of the art being stolen as a cultural heritage, significant piece, to encompass the theft of important jewels or stuff like that from various countries like Africa, even golds and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, I don't think there's not a specific category of object. So again, yes, jewels or very precious stones can absolutely form part of this kind of claims. But then you need to know exactly the details of the circumstances in which these stones were given. If at some point, so for example, and that's where it becomes very complicated to establish, like again, not even talking about legal, at the legal aspect of this, but just like the moral or ethical aspect. If these stones, for example, were gifted to a British envoy, to some Maharaja in India, to what extent was this a consensual gift? To what extent was there pressure to have this exchange? It's very delicate, and it forces us to make a judgment on events that happened in a very different context. So it's difficult to establish like a right or wrong in many of those instances.
Is documentation also a challenge? Like,
Yes.
it requires the community to have documented somewhere that this object belonged to them.
Yes, absolutely. Look, in the case of San Agustin, for example, so one of the persons who lives in this town of San Agustin and who initiated all this is actually an American citizen who's lived in that town for like 50 years, and he got really interested in this topic. So he told me how in the mid-1990s he went to Berlin because he wanted to see the statues. I miss some details, and next time I speak to him I'll have to ask because I don't know how he did that. But at that time, the museum actually let him go into the warehouse of the museum, and he actually found statues that nobody knew were there. Like, he thought there were like maybe 32 statues or something like that, and then opening boxes, he found that there were 35. So there was no record anywhere that Preuss had taken that many statues. So it's a daunting task. So for that matter, how do you prove that this statue is actually from that archaeological site? It's a daunting task. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about the money, right? Because these things have been bought and sold for different prices, right? So what happens, like a museum, let's say a piece has been discovered and it has to be repatriated, but they paid maybe millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands for these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the responsibility for payment, especially since most of these pieces seem to be ill-gotten?
That's what I really like about it, because that's political negotiation. So, like in the case of Machu Picchu that I was giving you, Yale in the end paid paid to send back the
But
collection.
had they purchased them, and then would insurance cover this or
Right.
something if a museum is found to have a collection that has to be returned? That
Well,
they had already purchased?
Okay, I can think of another example to give you. So in Peru as well, there were textiles from the Paracas culture that were in the Swedish museum. They enveloped mummies that were found in the desert. The Swedish museum agreed to return those textiles to Peru. They built the boxes that were needed with vibration control. They paid for insurance, and that was in the millions of dollars. And it is, we could argue that they somehow did that out of colonial guilt, out of, for lack of a better term, because Sweden was never a colonial power there. But so again, there is no blueprint for this.
Yeah.
All this is to be negotiated between the parties. Yes.
Just follow up on, I think, where you're going, Tamara.
Yeah.
So the museum has just lost millions of dollars worth of valuable, assets, right? And they're no longer there. Like, they had paid that money, they had a thing, now they don't have that thing anymore, and there's a hole where that money, So is there insurance that covers that, or do they just write it off at the end of the year as we had a loss this year, and somebody, steps up and fills that in?
So first of all, very rarely do museums actually purchase these objects.
Okay.
They're being gifted by, wealthy donors, board members. Museums today do not have the means to compete in auctions, for example. Like when you have those big auctions of like the Lady in Gold that was sold for $100+ million, that was not purchased. No, actually it was. It was purchased by a private collector who in turn put it in the Neue Gallery in New York that he wanted to create. But it's not an institution itself that bought it. No museum these days has $100 million in acquisition funds. So, but yes, they do write it off. But absolutely. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. This has been really interesting. So following up on the last point that you made that was so interesting about socialization, I just wanted to know if part of that is also beginning to be an exploration of different views of what these objects are, because you're calling them objects, but I believe for the indigenous, they're living beings with a presence and a power.
Yep.
And so it's not really about the money, but it's about the power that they bring to a place or to a community.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering how that can be wrestled with such different worldviews we have about things or more than things.
Yeah. No. So you're absolutely right. Like, I'm using the word object, fully aware that many, in particular, I think of my anthropologist colleagues, would bark at me using this term because, indeed, those can be considered spirits or maybe even members of a family or of a community. So the word object in itself is disputed. But I think that what you're touching on really here is the very meaning of what it means to decolonize a museum. I think a museum that really wants to engage in this process has to agree that maybe the end game is that this object cannot stay there because it's just not its place. But again, it's not necessarily what happens. Like, some communities are happy with their objects being on display because, people get to know about them. It depends on what objects, what kind of relationship they have established with it. And in any case, if the object stays in the museum, then it should be displayed in accordance with the way this community or this person wants to represent themselves. And I think that, that's for me a very important part of this decolonization process. And I think that's what even the National Museum of the American Indian in DC, I think that's really what they've tried to do, no? Like, you visit this place and you have rooms about specific communities, and each community presents and introduces itself in completely different ways from the others. Some have continued maybe this very Western process of like a timeline and like what we could consider historical facts, and others have just a completely different way of presenting who they are and what they believe in. So I think that's a pretty interesting example of what can be done.
In the world, the museum world, how accepted is restitution as a thing to be doing? In other words, is the museum world pretty all on board, or are there many museums who are contesting these requests?
I think it depends a lot on, again, the type of museum we're talking about. It depends, I think there's a generational aspect to this too. I think younger curators who have been trained in decolonial thought are probably more open to the idea. So to give you an example, in the case of the Benin bronzes, there is a book that made a lot of noise 4 or 5 years ago that's called the Brutish Museum. And the guy who wrote this, Dan Hicks, he's actually the curator of the museum at Oxford. Don't quote me on this, but like of one of the university museums. And so clearly he is someone who was brought on board to that museum to really start this process of starting to consider a little differently what is in the collections and what should be done with it. And so one of his steps was the publication of this book that is really like a very, very strong argument in favor of sending all the Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. Now back a little bit relating to what you were saying, I think that part of the resistance that we see in those huge museums is precisely because many of these objects have been paid for by very wealthy collectors, and these people have no intention that these objects that they paid for are now being sent back for free to another country or another. So again, I think here you have political dynamics that are also internal to the institution. So yeah, I don't think there is a very clear-cut answer to this, but there's, again, certainly more. I think there's also the idea, again, that sending back objects does not mean the end of the museum. There's a different type of work that can be done. But if the mission is to educate the public, there are many different ways of doing this. So if you send back, and I've seen that in Latin America actually. For example, with the Museum of Fine Arts in San Francisco, they had murals from Teotihuacan, they sent back some of those to Mexico. That led, and we're talking here about 1980s, so already a few decades ago. From there, both sides, like the Mexicans told me so, San Francisco told me so, they really started collaborating on more projects, which they had not done before. So it can really be the start for something else. And I think that for some people in the museum world, this has become like an evidence. And so of course, like the view you have on the question of restitution changes based on this experience. Yeah.
Scott? This morning I had a board of directors meeting of the Vermont Conference of the United Church of Christ. And we approved a resolution that will be presented to the conference that if a church uses what are termed appropriately Negro spirituals within a worship context, that $10 is donated to the Vermont Conference, and the Vermont Conference then funds arts or music programs or students well, basically BIPOC population in Vermont, or even say African American historical colleges or universities. And so my question is, we've mostly been talking about objects. Are there examples of restitution or returning of non-objects? Because those Negro spirituals, the composers, of course, if there were, whether the composers were a collective or whether it was one person, they never received royalties or credit or anything. So it's the church's effort to compensate, almost retroactively, but it's not for an object. Are there other examples of that?
Yes, that I can, like on the top of my head, I know that in the fashion world, this question has come up a lot with designers appropriating designs from like traditional clothes in Central America. It has happened a lot. So then you have the ensuing scandal of cultural appropriation. So I have now seen examples of some of these designers doing this like purposefully, working with local people for the production, and also like sending back part of the profits. But yeah, it's something that has happened a lot, definitely, and not always with the appropriate recognition for.
Isn't it considered intellectual property law?
Yeah.
Such as copyright law, and if somebody writes something,
Absolutely.
now, as I understand it, you write something, you don't even have to put the copyright symbol, but you are copyrighted, so if somebody illegally copies it, they're breaking the law. Am I
Yeah.
accurate? Is this intellectual property?
No, I completely agree, and that this is like maybe a little tangential for me as a topic,
Yes.
because I'm
But
not
just
an
saying,
expert
because of what he was talking about,
Yeah.
it's intellectual type.
Yeah,
property,
it's
writing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The problem here is to be able to copyright or not being able to copyright designs, for example, or songs that have no clearly identified composer or conceptor, where the sense of ownership may not be individual but collective. So those are questions that, again, the Western concept of intellectual property has a little bit of a difficulty to accommodate. But,
And maybe the last question.
Thank you, Pierre.
Then we have one more.
Oh, okay.
Not sure if you would know about this, but are you aware if this process that you've been discussing tonight has been engaged by this institution, Brattleboro Museum?
I have to admit, I do not know, but I'm not sure this is a collecting institution.
It's not.
Right. So I don't think that this institution collects, so that would probably not apply to them.
There's no.
Okay, I remember reading about a collection of Latin American objects that was donated a couple of years ago. I'm
Yeah.
wondering what happened to it.
I don't specifically, but you are correct about that. And I believe that there is a lot of discussion right now about what's going to happen with that, so,
It's in
Yeah.
limbo.
yes.
Okay.
It was a collection of what, sorry? What did you say? What collection was that?
Latin American objects.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not,
Yeah, I actually had a question from someone before the conference about that. What we do see a lot happening, and it's particularly true with like Mexico, Colombia, Peru. A lot of people try now to just get rid of collections of objects. Oftentimes because they are maybe younger people inheriting these collections from their parents, grandparents, with maybe no interest in collecting, with maybe actually a different sense, like, or different ethical conception about whether or not they should have these objects. So what we do see a lot happening is that people just literally drop these objects in like embassies and consulates. And so you go to the Mexican or the Colombian consulate in New York and they have like a room with like dozens of objects until at some point they find some money to bring everything back. The point I was making to the person who asked me about this before is that those are objects that, first of all, we don't necessarily know if they are genuine because they may have been fakes. Old fakes, they may be beautiful objects, but we don't really know if they are like original. And in a way, those are objects that can have like maybe some purpose in art history, but in history or in archaeology, they have lost all their information because we don't know anything about their context. We don't know where they were found, in what conditions. So it's, oftentimes like there is stuff dropped at the consulate of Mexico, and I've talked to people and they're like, this is probably not even from Mexico. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? So it's a complicated question.
I just wanted to mention, having worked in the field, I just know that at some point these relics or treasures that get returned from a museum or from some collection, at some point they will suffer over time. Things get damaged, things that I've never seen it not happen, and spectrographs, lasers, infrared machines, all of these apparatus that goes into the conservation of antiquities is very costly. Who is responsible? Maybe a fund should be set up when these objects are returned. A fund should go with it to be invested somehow so that it keeps generating money, because it's never going to stop demanding more, care and preservation. So I just wondered, that's what I've seen all my life, is the deterioration of everything.
But I think that actually many museums do practice this, like when they return objects, or even when they don't return, like they have cooperation agreements with a specific country to form experts. To be sure, all these countries have their own experts who do not necessarily to be formed here, but like all these kind of questions can be treated in a context that is not necessarily related to a return, but the moment of a return, and I think that this is where it actually becomes even more interesting. It does not have to be just, let's take one object from a museum and let's send it to a different place. It is like, what can we build around this? We can build cooperation around education, around exhibition programs, around receiving 10 researchers from here in Mexico for 2 years to be trained in Mesoamerican pre-Columbian art. So I think that there are, the moment of the return can just in the end be a pretext for a lot of other things. And I think that this is where really it becomes interesting for a museum. And not like, it's not an end in itself. It doesn't have to be. Yes.
How do we get your book? I'm sorry, if we can't buy it here.
Oh, online.
I've got to
Yeah,
get it.
you Google it, you'll find it.
Yeah.
Kind of more of a comment, but to your point of returning the object not being the end of the opportunity to study it at the institution that had returned it. Visited one of the Harvard museums last spring, and there was an exhibition of Howard Carter artifacts and Assyrian reliefs that had been acquired on behalf of Harvard. But when you kind of lean in and you read the story, they are all 3D printed. So they had these objects, they 3D printed them, and then they returned the artifacts and objects to their origin, where they'd been found, and these are still artifacts and objects that are being actively studied through this incredible technology of 3D printing. We're blown away. So.
In some instances, actually, the digitalization has also been used against the idea of returning. Kind of being like, we're going to digitize this in super high resolution for you, so you don't really need the original object. When you can just like return the argument, right? Like, just give us the original one, you keep the 3D copy, and you continue your study with the 3D copy. So it goes both ways.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.